Suburban West London, one unlikely side of the 18-year battle for the right to say the original Star Wars Stormtroopers were their creation. The other in San Francisco at the Skywalker Ranch, home of George Lucas's Star Wars empire. Home for Andrew Ainsworth, the original Stormtrooper prop maker, is a converted sweet shop on Twickenham Green. 4 decades ago, both young men were struggling to find their way in the world. George's 1971 science fiction film THX 1138 had been a critical success, but a financial disaster. Whilst Andrew, who was emerging from an engineering and arts degree, set about building his own sports car, the Bullock. He built 52 of them before he realised they were probably never going to make his fortune. Then in 1973, George made the low-budget film American Graffiti. It became a box office smash and enabled him to personally invest in the Star Wars production, allowing him to hold on to the movie rights and perhaps more importantly, the rights to merchandising. Andrew began to produce a variety of interior products and had lucrative contracts with leading stores. He set about converting the rundown sweet shop into a plastics manufacturing base.
What was it, about 1975? I was 27 years old and lots to go for.
Nick Pemberton, an established scenic artist, lived next door.
I first met Andrew when he and Bernadette moved into the shop on the green at Twickenham.
Well, Nick I was always a little bit in awe of, in truth.
He'd been employed to help ease the pressure on the props department of the first Star Wars film that was being made at the nearby Elstree Studios.
Landing the Star Wars job was very easy. Prop buyer on that production got in touch with me and said he needed some helmets sculpted. Was I interested? And I said yes. Went along and met a young man called George Lucas, and I was very impressed by his shoes. I'd never seen trainers before.
This was pretty much before Lucas had any established base at Elstree Studios. It was the back end of 1975.
With a tight budget, George Lucas was keeping a firm grip on the entire production.
It's the only thing I've ever worked on where I was actually briefed by the director of the film.
The Stormtroopers were still at their formative stage, so Nick sculpted a clay mock-up for George's consideration. The studio also produced an interpretation on the right of this picture. George opted for Nick's, but Nick was busy on other productions and knew even if he could get the design right, he didn't have the capability to produce the helmets, so he asked Andrew to get involved.
Nick knew what I was doing with plastics. His idea was that if anything would come of this film, he'd just subcontract it to me and sort of make 10% off the deal.
He took the sculpture back to Twickenham to show Andrew, but left it in his car over a very frosty night. By the time he got it out, it had pretty much disintegrated. Andrew now had to start again from scratch. He thought the best way to make a helmet that could be reproduced in bulk was by vacuum forming. To enable him to do that, it had to be fundamentally redesigned. First, he had to make forming moulds without hard edges so that the thermoplastic could be formed over it. And because the helmet had undercuts, it would have to be made in a number of components, then joined together. Normally the moulds would be cast in metal, but there was neither time or budget to do this, so he devised an ingenious process of mixing resins with metal flakes to make a heat-resistant compound. which he used to build up the sculptural shape. When the metallic composite had dried hard, it could be finished off and detailed, ready for the vacuum former. Only after all the elements were formed, trimmed and joined together was the first Stormtrooper born.
I sculpted up a prototype together. I gave it back to Nick. Nick took it to his customer, and his customer said, "That's perfect." At that point, Nick came back and said, "Well, I want 50 of them, but I'll tell you what, the customer's this chap called George Lucas."
It was just another opportunity, and then we just grabbed it.
I'd never heard of him, I'd never heard of L Street Studios, I'd never heard of the film company.
In 1976, the UK film industry was heavily controlled by the film unions. Nick was a member, but Andrew wasn't. Andrew produced 50 Stormtrooper helmets for the production and invoiced them through Nick, so the studios and the unions were none the wiser. Whilst all that was going on, the studio props department had been tasked with making the Stormtrooper armour that needed to be ready for the imminent start of location filming in Tunisia. But things were not going at all to plan.
I was called to the studio with a big note in Nick Pemberton's diary saying panic.
They were absolutely driven by the fact that they had to have it by the date they were filming. It just had to be.
If they didn't solve the method of making the armour, I presume the shoot just would not have happened.
Andrew set to work to produce prototype Stormtrooper armour that could be mass produced and took it to Elstree for George's approval. They wouldn't let him in.
I went to the studios for a meeting and they kept me on the gate because I didn't have a union ticket to get in. When I asked for someone for George Lucas, they hadn't heard of him and they went away and found someone who had in about a couple of hours. My objective was to get the Stormtrooper costume working correctly. I cut it about in front of him. I remember I took a grinderette with me and cut the armour while it was on an actor. Everybody was a little bit aghast, but that's the way you do it. You get it working there and then and get a decision on it. I think at this point, or when I physically cut the armour on a human being in front of him and got it to work, must have impressed him somewhat, because he carried on to say, "Well, can you make something else then?" This was always the way the film went. As soon as you'd made one character and it was successful, they came back with yet another. And so he asked me if I could make a back piece of what turned out to be the TIE pilot. I went home that evening, cut a Stormtrooper and an X-Wing pilot together, mated them, came back the next day with a new character, and it all moved on that way.
There was a frantic race against time to produce 50 complete sets of the complex armour and get them chemically welded together, ready for the Tunisian shoot.
I think I had 4 weeks from conception to the delivery date in the desert, and so it was a real rush. Considering there are 40 sets of moulds in the Stormtrooper costume.
Having saved the day with the armour and schedules becoming increasingly tight, John Mollo, the Star Wars costume designer, began asking Andrew to come up with more and more characters.
Yeah, I think the production was totally reliant on Andrew coming up with what they needed.
And really we just came up trumps every time.
Nick handed the job to Andrew to charge directly. This invoice is for the Stormtrooper armour. This for Andrew's newly made rebel troops, and, as he called them, the jawbone and cheese grater helmets. And this one for the rebel pilot helmets and their chest armour.
Apart from the Stormtrooper and the back of the TIE pilot helmet, which Lucas showed me as a little photograph, I made all the other characters, the X-Wing helmets, the TIE pilots, the cheese grater, the jawbone, the 3 rebel pilots, and parts of the Tusken Raiders, and they all went without change completely to the studios. There was no drawings to begin with, and the studios just accepted them as they were.
There was nobody else who could do it. You know, he was their absolute answer.
When the film was finally released, there were people close to the production who found it difficult to believe just how it had so dramatically taken the world by storm.
I had considered Star Wars to be such a low budget production that I was just totally astonished when suddenly there was this well-made film.
A New Hope cost just $11 million to make and grossed an incredible $775 million at the box office, launching George on a trajectory to movie immortality. Andrew, on the other hand, pretty much forgot about it for the next 30 years.